Hello, Deborah Yaffe. Thank you very much for joining me on this new series of At Home with Austen for A Bit Lit. I wondered if you could start by telling me about yourself.
Sure. So my name is Deborah Yaffe. I'm a journalist, and about 10 years or so ago, after having been a lifelong Jane Austen fan, I decided that I wanted to write a book about this community of Jane Austen fans, of really passionate, obsessive, crazy Jane Austen fans. And so the result of that was this book, Among the Janeites, A Journey Through the World of Jane Austen Fandom. Oh, we have our matching copies. How nice.
They're beautiful.
Which is essentially a series of profiles of people who are very, very interested and obsessed with Jane Austen in a whole bunch of different ways. Some of them want to dress up in Regency costume and kind of connect Jane Austen that way. Some of them have really unusual interpretations of what's going on in her stories. Some of them founded online fan communities to talk with other Austen fans, or in real life fan communities for that matter. So I just wanted to survey kind of the whole range of versions of Jane Austen addiction that are out there, and that's the book.
Wonderful. And when you approached it, were you a recovering Jane Austen addict yourself, would you say? Were you looking for kind of like minds who were similarly, equally obsessively, passionately involved in Jane Austen novels, or did you feel you were slightly sort of apart from that?
Well, I'm certainly not a recovering Jane Austen addict because I'm still the addiction. I don't think I'm ever going to recover. I would say that as a journalist, you try to have a certain amount of distance, in that you want to be looking at people's stories in a somewhat objective way, so that you can ask the right questions and the kinds of questions you need to ask to explain them to other people. But I certainly was what anthropologists call a participant observer, in that, I was going to these events as a Jane Austen fan and, immersing myself in the conversations and having a really great time doing it at the same time.
Wonderful. And in the book, you mentioned that when you first started encountering these fan communities, it was almost a surprise, because you said that you knew on the one hand that Austen was this well-known figure, but on the other hand, you were sort of surprised when people described her as famous, because she felt like such a sort of personal figure for you. So how did your engagement with her sort of change when it went from being that very personal engagement to suddenly this world of fandom?
So so I first encountered Jane Austen really as a young child. My father was an English teacher at a local college, what the British, I guess, would call a university, but a small one. And he was very passionate about 19th century English literature, and he started me very young reading a lot of great writers. And so he gave me my first copy of Pride and Prejudice when I was 10, and I read it and really loved her and read all the rest of her novels. But I was a precocious reader, and there weren't that many other people my own age who were interested in these kinds of books. So this was kind of a passion that I shared with my father, I guess, but not really with a lot of other people my own age. And then when I was a teenager, my parents bought me a membership in the Jane Austen Society of North America, which was an organization that had gotten started in 1979. And I went to one of their conferences in 1983, which was the fall of my first year at university. And that was when I heard Jane Austen described as being someone who was, so famous that she really didn't need us fans to keep her in the public eye and to keep her popular. And that was when I had that moment of, yeah, right. Because up to that point I had experienced her so much as my own thing. It was a little bit odd to hear her described as someone that a whole bunch of other people knew about. But back then, Jane Austen fandom did not have the kind of superheated quality that it gained later on. So even then, although I really enjoyed talking to all these fellow Jane Austen fans, and I went to another conference in 1999, so I'd had more opportunities to engage with fans. But I think it really is the internet communities and the proliferation of movies of Jane Austen, filmed adaptations of Jane Austen, that has really kind of turbocharged that whole realm of Jane Austen fandom. Sorry for this noise.
Absolutely.
This is, I think, some kind of a garbage truck on our street.
Oh no, don't worry at all. All the fun of lockdown filming. We can hear you loud and clear. So yeah, there's so much I sort of want to ask you about that, but maybe we could start with you, age 10. so that's an astonishingly young age to be reading Pride and Prejudice. What caught you about the novel at age 10 and made you go, I love this? Because I feel like I maybe read at age 13 and it got me where I was kind of on the edge of adolescence and interested in romantic comedies, and I felt that was what drew me in. But what at 10 was your kind of Austen?
I think, alas, you are much closer to 13 than I am to 10. So it is really hard for me to remember. I know that I engaged all of the classic novels that my father had me reading when I was arguably too young to read them. I think I really just engaged with on the level of story and character. I didn't get what, I sometimes referred to when I was a kid as the inner meaning. I was not really, I certainly didn't have any theories. I wasn't really thinking about the language, things that became more interesting to me as I got older and became a more sophisticated reader. I think it was really just plot and character. And the thing about Jane Austen is her characters are just great. And even if you're a kid, they will remind you of people that you know. I can't say that I remember that was what I experienced as a reader at that age, but I'm guessing that was what I experienced. When I was writing Among the Janeites, I went back to my childhood journals to try to see when I had read her and what I had thought. And mostly my journals were just records. I read this book, I read that book, I went to the dentist, I went to school, this kind of thing. And the only place that I actually said anything was I finished reading Mansfield Park. It is a wonderful book. And I was very curious about that because Mansfield Park is, of course, the Jane Austen novel that probably has the fewest number of passionate Jane Austen fans getting excited about it. Yes. It has a heroine who's sort of quiet and reserved and comes across as maybe a little bit mousy and not as charismatic as Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. And I'm not sure, maybe to some extent I was maybe a little quiet and mousy and not charismatic at that age, and maybe I related to that a little bit. And the fact that the quiet, mousy, not charismatic girl ends up getting the guy when the beautiful, charming, witty, charismatic girl doesn't, I'm sure there was a little bit of wish fulfillment going on there too. But again, I'm somewhat guessing because I don't have a memory of that.
But that's so interesting because I feel like the thing that people often find frustrating about Fanny Price is her sort of extreme goodness and the fact that she isn't even really that tempted by the dashing bad boy. I mean, I feel like in Pride and Prejudice, Lizzie is tempted by Wickham, and in Sense and Sensibility, Marianne is very tempted by Willoughby. With Fanny, she knows who she loves all the way through. And do you think was that part of it too? Did you like that fact that she had that steadfastness, or did you judge her slightly for not being tempted?
Yeah, I don't know. I would doubt, because I'm reading Mansfield Park when I'm like maybe 11 or something, I read all the novels over maybe 18 months or something. And, I doubt that I was that sophisticated a reader at that point. I think it was much more straightforwardly, I want to know what happens next, and I'm identifying with or laughing at these people. Right. And, I've got to say, I think that's not a bad way to read. I mean, I think that being engaged with the lives of the characters that you're reading about, that's one of the great pleasures of reading. And I would never tell anybody that that's a bad way to read. In fact, in general, I dislike it when people are told that there's a particular way that you ought to read or that you have to like something. And so one of the things that's interesting to me about studying Jane Austen fandom is that there are so many different ways that people read Jane Austen. There are so many different Jane Austens that people find in her work. And, some of them seem a little wacky to me. And I'm like, ooh, I just don't interpret it that way. But that's kind of fascinating and exciting that there's a writer who can stimulate so many different responses in people.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned that you feel like the combination of the internet and the TV and media adaptations were what kind of brought this kind of intense fandom into being. And so do you think with the internet is part of it that it allows for people to sort of connect over those sort of battles over which point of view you inhabit, which of these brilliantly drawn characters do you take the side of?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, one small corrective to what you just said, or to what I said. So Devaney Lozer, who's a Jane Austen scholar, has recently written a book called The Making of Jane Austen, which talks about the kind of Jane Austen fandom that existed, long before there was any internet or TV or any of that. And she's certainly uncovered a lot of things that I didn't know about, ways that people were engaging with Jane Austen long before there was an internet. So it's not that there was no Jane Austen fandom before this. I think there's a certain kind of popular culture turbocharged high profile quality that comes with the internet. And I definitely do think that the thing that the internet does is allows people to create community with people they wouldn't necessarily ever run across in their physical lives, right? And sometimes this is not so great as when people create community with, you know, fellow child abusers or something horrible like that. But oftentimes it's wonderful, as when, for instance, you know, a Jane Austen fan in New Jersey, where I live, can meet a Jane Austen fan in England or India or France or whatever, and they can all discover that they have a lot in common in terms of how they relate to this wonderful writer. So I think that's part of it. And the internet got going sort of like the World Wide Web got going sort of like mid to late 90s, right? And that's right around the same time that there's just this spate of Jane Austen adaptations came out. There are like five or six Jane Austen adaptations came out between 1995 and 1997. And so there's a lot of material out there for people to talk about, a lot of comparisons of the movies to the books, of the movies to each other, you know, a lot of talking about which characters you find appealing and which actors you like. And there's just, and also all of that provides a lot of stimulation to the imagination of fan fiction writers, people who want to take Jane Austen's characters and put them into new situations, want to write sequels to the stories, want to reimagine the stories in a contemporary context, all of that. So I just think it's kind of this fertile brew that gets going and then keeps kind of feeding on itself in that way.
Right, that makes so much sense. And I'm going to ask you more about the movies in a moment, but I wondered if I could just quickly ask you, in terms of the movies, do you have, or the TV adaptations, do you have a favorite Austen adaptation that you're kind of wedded to?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite of the filmed adaptations is the Sense and Sensibility adaptation from 1995, which Emma Thompson wrote and starred in, and which Ang Lee directed. Yes. I think that's a beautiful movie, and in some ways, and in some respects, improves upon aspects of the book that are problematic. Probably my runner-up would be the iconic 1995 Pride and Prejudice, with starring Colin Firth and Jennifer Ellie, script by Andrew Davis. That's the one known as the wet shirt Pride and Prejudice, because there's a scene in it when Colin Firth, playing Mr. Darcy, jumps into a pond for a refreshing swim and then strides home across the meadow with his wet white shirt clinging to his manly chest. And it's very like, it appears to be very erotic for a lot of people. So that moment kind of became a big key moment. And of course, that's a moment that's not in Austen's novel at all in any way, shape, or form. That's my runner-up. And the other Jane Austen movie that I really love is Clueless, which is an adaptation of Emma, but updated to contemporary, or then contemporary, Beverly Hills, California. And I think that's just a really witty and charming and clever movie in its own right. And it's also a very witty update of Jane Austen. So those are the three that are my top. I also, before we go further, I want to make sure and introduce my Jane Austen action figure, which I have here. This is like a product of 1990s fandom. So this is my Jane Austen action figure. She comes with her own, I don't know if I can turn this to the camera, her own little lap desk. Copy
so if you raise it a little higher, oh yes.
Copy of Pride and Prejudice, quill pen, and a lap desk. And Jane Austen actually did have a lap desk like this, which you can see at the British Library. So yeah, I just want to, this is a little gift that people, Jane Austen fans, are often given by their friends and relatives. So as I was.
Does she move? Can you move her arms and things, or is she a static?
You can, but my Jane has recently suffered some severe injuries, and I've had to glue her. So I don't risk, re-involving the wound. But yes, her arms will move up and down, and I think you can make her hold the lap desk if you do it exactly right. But yeah, just wanted to make sure and get that in there.
Fabulous. Yeah, thank you for including that. And that's so interesting, because I suppose that's another example of, like the fan fiction, of a way that these stories can kind of be reimagined and the characters can be taken and sort of reimagined separately, except in this case, it's Austen herself sort of becoming a figure for play.
And in fact, there's a whole like strand of what you might call fan fiction in which Jane Austen herself is a character. And there's a series where Jane Austen is a detective solving mysteries, and there's a series where there's separate books, not necessarily a series, where Jane Austen gets involved in love affairs of her own, or where there's one where she's an imaginary friend to somebody dispensing love, like she's in somebody's head dispensing advice to them as their own love affair goes on. There's one series where she's a vampire running a bookshop in upstate New York. So, there's like
amazing
many, many versions of this. She's become this iconic figure who is detached from her context and able to be re-imported into a whole bunch of different contexts.
And that's so interesting, because I feel like the two first examples you gave there, on the one hand, love stories of her own, and the other, the friend dispensing advice, are sort of the two almost competing versions of Austen. In that, the question I was thinking of asking about the movie adaptations was, I mean, I feel that the three examples you chose are wonderful because they have a sense of the nuance and the complexity and the humor and the darkness, as well as the love stories of Austen. I think all of them are very kind of aware of wanting to be about family as well as romantic love. And I mean, Clueless is so self-aware about the way it's transforming Emma into a new context. But I wondered if you thought that some of the Austen adaptations over the years have kind of turned the popular idea of Austen into more of a rom-com, in terms of this desire to imagine Austen herself in all of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's no question that the movies foreground the romance. And although all of Austen's novels are about men and women falling in love and getting married, I would not call them romance novels, because I think that they are much more about that. They're about that moment in a young woman's life when she has to make a choice that, in the period that Jane Austen's writing about, is really the choice for a woman. This is the choice about what your life is going to look like, because once you marry somebody, there's no going back. You're not going to divorce him. You're not going to have a career of your own that's separate from his life. Throwing in your lot with this man means picking a certain kind of life. And if you pick wrong, that's a catastrophe. And so you have to figure out who you are and what your values are in order to figure out who you should marry. So to me, the novels are much more about that. They're much more about moral choice and deciding who you are and what your values are and what kind of life you consider to be the good life. And the man is incidental to that to some extent. And and I would actually argue, even in Sense and Sensibility, that the romantic relationship is not even the central relationship or most important relationship in the book. The movies, though, are really romances. The movies are about extremely attractive men and extremely attractive women falling in love. And there is nothing wrong with that. I love those movies. But it does mean that Jane Austen has come to stand for romance to people who don't know her except from the movies. And when, so you'll see online all sorts of places where people say, oh, it's a Jane Austen story, or it's a Jane Austen movie, or it's that's just so Jane Austen. And what they mean is that's a romantic comedy, or that's about people falling in love, or even that's kind of a soppy, silly, little girly kind of a thing. And all of that, I just think, has relatively little to do with what's actually on the page if you pick up a Jane Austen novel.
Absolutely. Yeah, and especially because she has...
What's interesting about her really is that she has this pop culture presence and status that overlaps with who she is in the academy and as a writer, but isn't the same as that. And there aren't very many writers that's true of, I think. I mean, you think of a writer like Arthur Conan Doyle in the Sherlock Holmes books. Those have a gigantic pop culture presence, probably even a bigger one than Jane Austen, but not the same status in the academy, I don't think. He, I don't think, would be regarded as the kind of giant of English literature that Jane Austen is. Then you think of somebody like probably the closest similar one to Jane Austen is Shakespeare, who of course is the giant of English literature and also has something of the pop culture presence, but I think not quite as high a pop culture presence as Jane Austen does. I mean, I could be wrong about that. You're more the Shakespeare scholar, but my sense is that there are not so many, online fan communities dedicated to people arguing about Jane Austen, about Shakespeare's characters, or podcasts of people talking about Shakespeare. So she has that double quality.
Absolutely. And maybe not as much Shakespeare fan fiction, I feel, as well, because I mean, you know, there's Shakespeare in Love, and I suppose there was also Anonymous, which is, yeah, we won't go there in terms of the Shakespeare author controversy.
And then there's that, and then there was that series, which might still be ongoing, where they had great writers, great contemporary writers, take one Shakespeare play and update them. And there was a similar project for Jane Austen, which was markedly unsuccessful. I think some of the Shakespeare ones actually have been quite good books in themselves. The Jane Austen ones, for the most part, were terrible. So.
Oh, and that's so interesting because there has been this kind of this vogue for attempting to modernize or rewrite or reimagine these stories, and I suppose there's a tension there between Shakespeare's doing something so different in terms of using sources and stories that already exist, while I suppose with Austen it's what is the thing that you're adapting and reimagining, and as you say, so much of it is contextually specific about people's attempts to make these life choices in this particular kind of conditions. And you're right that Clueless was very canny in the way it sort of updated that, but I suppose it's more difficult.
And I think part of the reason Clueless works really well is because it updates it to high school. So the characters that you're updating to are kids, and the social structures of high school are very class bound in a way that our adult social structures are less so now, at least in the United States. We like to think. We probably deceive ourselves, but you know, that kind of rigid structure where, you know, you're either in the in-group or you're in the out-group makes a whole lot more sense in a high school context than it does in an adult context, which is why I think a lot of adult Jane Austen, you know, adaptations of Jane Austen that try to bring her stories into an adult contemporary context often seem a little weird. You know, things that happen don't make a lot of sense because adults have many more choices now, and certainly women have many more choices now than they did in Jane Austen's time. But in the high school setting of Clueless, a lot of that stuff fit right in, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I mean, I could keep talking about Jane Austen adaptations and fan fiction, and why isn't there more Shakespeare falling in love fan fiction, and where can I find the Austen fan fiction? But I want to make sure we have time to discuss a couple of things. The first is your amazing earrings, because I can see that you have Jane Austen earrings. Would you like to tell me about those?
Sure. So these are, can you see them?
A little bit higher, if that's all right. Yeah, brilliant.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so these earrings, which I obtained at a Jane Austen Society of North America conference, have a picture of Jane Austen on them, which you Brits might recognize as being the same picture of Jane Austen that's on the 10-pound note. But what's funny about Jane Austen for a famous writer is that we actually don't know a lot about her life. And one of the things we don't know is really what she looked like, because there's only one picture of her face that everybody agrees was taken from life, which is a sketch that her sister Cassandra made of her, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery. And it's famously makes her look sort of peevish and like not happy. I think it's been described as looking like a peevish chipmunk, I believe. So it's not an attractive picture. And when her nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, decided in 1870 that he was going to write a book about her, a memoir of her life, he and the other family members who were doing this wanted to have a picture of her as the frontispiece to the book, and they couldn't really find one. And they had the Cassandra sketch, and they were sort of like, you know, so they got an artist to kind of pretty it up, and that's this picture. So a Victorian artist prettied up the Cassandra sketch and created this picture, and that's the picture that you'll now see a lot as the picture of Jane Austen. But when it was done, one of her nieces, who had known her when the niece was a child, looked at it and said, "It's very pretty, doesn't really look like her." So this picture that is now like the iconic representation of Jane Austen is a picture that the people who actually knew what Jane Austen looked like thought didn't really look like her. And that's kind of what we're fascinating. So in a way, it's a kind of interesting metaphor for how elusive Jane Austen is, right? We don't actually know even what she looks like. And then, you know, famously, her sister Cassandra who kept many of her letters for decades after Jane Austen died, but then burned many of them before her own death. And, you know, why she did that is a source of endless speculation. But as a result, we have only about 160 letters that Jane Austen wrote, even though this was a culture in which women wrote letters, you know, dozens of letters every day or week of the year. So she undoubtedly wrote thousands of letters. We have 160 of them. So we are left with a relatively slim amount of biographical information about her, which has not, of course, prevented there from being like dozens of biographies, but that's a whole other topic. And so we're really left with the novels. And the novels are not biographical sources, except people like to mine them as such. So people will read them, conclude that this character seems like it must be based on somebody that Jane Austen knew, or this situation seems like it echoes something that we know happened to Jane Austen. And then they'll read back from the novel onto her life. You know, they'll say, if this character is unpleasant in this book, that must mean Jane Austen didn't like the real life version of that person in real life. And, you know, I hate that. It's just like, it just completely misrepresents the project of fiction writing to me, which, you know, is about imaginative transformation. I mean, it's possible that's true, but we just really have no idea what Jane Austen's process was like. And we do not know whether she literally imported this person into her book and all of the things she felt about them, or whether she thought to herself, you know, here's Mary. I'm not crazy about her, but imagine if she was really, really bad. You know, imagine, you know, maybe she's stretching something, you know, starting here and taking it here. And then we arrive here and think that's where she must have started. And we really don't have any reason to believe that. So it's just,
or maybe she's stealing features from different people, real life people, and combining them to make a character who does a particular thing. Or absolutely. I feel like the image in your earrings becomes a good metaphor again there, because it's kind of people trying to shape, just as we end the kind of in popular culture, the rom-com image of the film adaptations sort of shapes the novels. It's people trying to shape these particular stories around Austen that we kind of want to tell about her. My other question at this point, before we close up, is what you mentioned, the novel you wrote that you liked in your diary when you were 10 was Mansfield Park. What would you write that you like in your diary now if you were to do so?
Mansfield Park is not my favorite Jane Austen novel. What I usually say is that my favorite Jane Austen novel tends to be the one I just finished reading, but which in this case, at the moment would be Northanger Abbey, but actually that's not my favorite Jane Austen. I would say that if I was going to a desert island, like Desert Island Discs, right, and I was only allowed to take one, then I would take Persuasion. But that I would spend my whole time on the island being sad that I had not also been able to bring Pride and Prejudice and Emma along. So those three, I kind of cheat and say those three are probably my favorite. But Persuasion is a book that I think, it's not always the favorite book of a young person reading Jane Austen for the first time, but as you get older, Persuasion is a book that's a lot about second chances and regrets, and looking back at your life and thinking about the paths you could have taken and feeling like you made mistakes, or that you wish you could have a chance to fix the things you've done in the past. And that's maybe something that becomes much more salient to you as you get older and have some of those experiences of looking back and regret. And so I think that that's a book that has increased emotional resonance for me as I've gotten older, and therefore is the book that I would take at this point.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, very much sense. Although for anyone who's watching this who hasn't yet read Persuasion and who doesn't consider themselves at that point in life where they might think, oh, I'm older and I'm coming to it, it also, I feel, has like the best representation I've ever read in literature of that feeling of sitting in a room with other people, feeling awkward, not being sure whether you should look at them or not look at them. Are they looking at you? Should you say something? You probably won't say something. They're saying things to each other. You're listening very hard. And I feel like that's such a part of, for me anyway, the teenage experience, that I think the way it represents that in relation to Anne is just perfect.
I think though, if I'm recommending the book that you should read if you've never read any Jane Austen and you're just starting, though, I always tell people to read Pride and Prejudice first. I mean, I think it's been her most popular book since it was published. And I think that there's a reason for that. It's so funny and so beautifully constructed and just so joyful on so many levels. And I mean, there's a lot going on in it beyond that level of joy and cheerfulness. It's not a 100% happy book, but it's just a book that makes you feel great when you read it. So I really think people should start there. And this is the thing that I always say, you know, Jane Austen gets assigned in school a lot, certainly in the United States and probably in Britain even more,
Yeah.
And so there's a tendency for some people who don't really think they like 19th century literature to think of her as homework. And, it's all going to be long words and it's going to be really boring. What a drag that you have to read that book. And what I always want to tell people is Jane Austen is really funny. She is really a fun read and not a homeworky kind of a read. So I encourage people to give her a try for that reason, if no other.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Well, sadly, I think we're going to have to start to draw things to a close there. So maybe we could finish with the question that we ask everyone on a Bitlit at the end of an interview, which is the slightly impossible question: what is literature? Do you have an answer for that?
So for me, literature is books that you can read and reread over and over again and still find new and worthwhile things in them every time. And Jane Austen is certainly that kind of writer. Every time I read her, no matter how many, and I read all of her novels countless times, every time I read them, I find some new moment, some new line, some new insight that I didn't notice before. And I think that's why I'm going back to this book. So that's what literature is.
Thank you. What a beautiful answer to end on. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Deborah.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Would you like to share any other treasures from your time researching Jane Austen fandom?
Yeah, well, Jane Austen mugs are a thing. So this one has a quote from G.H. Lewis, the Victorian critic who was married to George Eliot. This is a quote that says, "First and foremost, let Jane Austen be named the greatest artist that has ever written, using the term to signify the most perfect mastery over the means to her end." And that line, I believe, is on a plaque outside of Chawton Cottage in Hampshire, where Jane Austen spent the last years of her life. I've also got a mug here that has a line from Northanger Abbey: "Nothing ever fatigues me but doing what I do not like," something that many of us might agree. And so this mug has on it a silhouette that is allegedly of Jane Austen, on the thinnest of evidence in my view, but which is often used to represent Jane Austen. On the back of it, it has a quote from Lady Susan, which is a lesser known novella of Jane Austen's, written probably relatively early in her career. And this quote is, "I am tired of submitting my will to the caprices of others." I bought this for my teenage son because I thought it was a kind of a line that teenagers could relate to in a pretty deep way. And then I've also got a Jane Austen tote bag here. This is was from the annual general meeting of the Jane Austen Society of North America in 2012. There's the silhouette again. Still allegedly Jane Austen.
In an apple.
Evidence. Well, because the conference was held in New York, the Big Apple, right?
Big Apple, yes.
Yeah, so this the Jane Comes to Brooklyn was the picture on the other side. This is the Brooklyn grid. So, yeah. So, and there's a lot more where that came from.
That's a wonderful collection. Thank you.